Welcome to WorkRise Shorts. My name is Megan Tackney, and I'm the Director of Partnerships at WorkRise. We are a research to action network that focuses on jobs, workers, and mobility housed at the Urban Institute. I'm so excited to be with Susan Lambert today. She is professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago. We will be digging into her newest research on Fair Workweek ordinances and how employees experience these laws. Thank you, Susan, for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Megan, for inviting me to talk some about the research that we're doing that's supported by WorkRise.
So my first question, Susan, is what exact problem were you hoping for your research to address, and what's the change you're hoping for the research to inspire?
Okay, well, and by that I mean myself, my colleague Julia Henley, and our very talented research team, what we hope to do is to add to knowledge on the extent to which these fair workweek ordinances are changing work scheduling practices for workers and jobs covered by these laws. And to do this, we fielded online surveys of about 1,700 employees working in retail and food service in 3 urban areas that have enacted Fair Workweek ordinances: Chicago, Seattle, and New York City. Respondents are paid participants in panels recruited through Qualtrics and its partners. And I think the unique perspective that we bring to this work is that it's informed by prior research that I've led in partnership with Anna Haley at Rutgers University, in which our team interviewed frontline retail and food service managers in Seattle and Chicago and how they are implementing these laws or not implementing them. And from our interviews, it's really clear that implementation of Fair Workweek laws is a process that takes time. The laws are complex and implementation proceeds unevenly, and not only across work sites, but across provisions, with some provisions being more consistently implemented than others. Just to give you a sense of how complicated these ordinances are, they include, multiple provisions. So they include a provision for advance notice, how far in advance employees must receive their work schedule, commonly 2 weeks in advance. Extra compensation when managers change the schedule, commonly called predictability pay or premium pay, and extra pay when somebody agrees to work a closely spaced shift, often called a clopening. There's the right to refuse to work additional or changed hours without the fear of retaliation, such as being scheduled for fewer hours in the future. And access to hours is another provision where managers have to offer newly available shifts to existing employees before hiring anybody new. And then there's a good faith estimate that the employer has to provide employees that tell them how much they'll work, and then the employer is obligated to kind of stay within that estimate, to schedule consistently with that. So because of our research on manager practices and our study of employee experiences, which is funded by WorkRise, we're paying particular attention to the extent to which the different provisions in the ordinances are making a difference for workers, and which provisions may need a bit more attention in terms of education and enforcement. Also, what we're hoping to do is to add knowledge on how administrative rules matter. So the administrative rules defining compliance with all of those provisions that I went over, they vary by city. And in New York, they're different for retail and fast food. So for example, each city has carve-outs in their administrative rules that allow employers to avoid paying predictability pay under specific circumstances. In Seattle, workers don't have to be paid extra if they volunteered to work in response to a request that was sent to multiple workers asking for volunteers to fill in for another employee who called off. Pretty complex? Yes. In Chicago, a worker doesn't have to be paid if the change is by mutual agreement, confirmed in writing before the change is implemented. But in New York fast food, if the employer changes the schedule or asks for the change, then the employee should receive some extra pay. So our employee survey was customized for each city to help us estimate compliance with each city's administrative rules for the different provisions of the ordinances and to see if those administration rules matter in terms of worker scheduling experiences. And what we hope is that our research will provide evidence useful for targeting the education and enforcement efforts and possibly for refining administrative rules.
So given how complicated all of these laws are, what have your research findings found?
Well, to date, our estimates indicate that the laws are making a difference to workers on 3 provisions across the cities. We draw these conclusions by comparing workers in comparable jobs located inside covered city limits to workers who are in the same jobs, basically outside in adjacent uncovered areas. And so far, and we've done robustness checks and we're continuing to do those. But the findings suggest that the laws are increasing advance notice. Workers in covered jobs are significantly more likely than those in uncovered jobs to receive their work schedule with the length of advance notice required by their city, commonly 2 weeks. And, specifically, we estimate that the law provides a 10 to 20% boost in the proportion of workers receiving at least 2 weeks advance notice. This is very comparable to those of you who are following this kind of research is very comparable to what the SHIFT project is finding, who's also studying these issues. We also find that the laws are delivering additional compensation when a manager requests or requires additional or different hours. So workers in covered jobs are more likely than those of their uncovered, counterparts to receive extra pay for manager-driven shift extensions. So when you stay later than you were scheduled to work, and for hour additions and schedule changes, and also when they've agreed to work closely spaced shifts. But we're not observing any differences between covered and uncovered workers in their likelihood of receiving pay for hour reductions. And in fact, 70% of covered workers in our sample who were asked or required by a manager to leave work early said they were not compensated for the hours they lost as required by the law. We also find that the laws are increasing employee control over their hours. And this is, I think, a key provision that hasn't received very much attention. It's the right to say no to different or additional hours. So we find that covered workers are more likely to report that they were told by a manager that you can say no to this request. And a larger proportion of covered than uncovered workers reported that they had said no to a request. But there's a caveat here. We also find that, and as we'll present in our forthcoming research brief, that about 20% of covered workers reported that they feared they'd be scheduled for fewer hours in future weeks if they said no to a manager's request. And 20% of those who had said no reported that they had been scheduled for fewer hours. So the part of the ordinance that says you can decline changes without retaliation may need a bit of attention. In terms of our findings related to how administrative rules matter, a couple of things are standing out to us. The New York City retail law only requires that workers receive their work schedule 72 hours in advance, whereas in Chicago and Seattle, it's 2 weeks notice. Now, 88% of New York City retail workers in our sample reported that they received their work schedule at least 72 hours in advance. So that's that's high compliance. But I received my schedule 72 hours in advance back in the 1970s when I worked for Sears going through college. So, the bar's not particularly high. Only 38% of New York retail workers reported 2 weeks advance notice. In contrast, in Seattle, 71% of retail workers in our sample said they received 2 weeks advance notice as required by that law. So Seattle's law was enacted before New York City's, but I think these results suggest that setting the bar high and allowing managers some time to adjust their practices may make it possible to deliver greater predictability to workers. Another example of how administrative rules matter is that the mass communication exemption for premium pay that I went over before means that what we see is that a much smaller proportion of workers in Seattle than in Chicago or New York received extra pay when they experienced the same types of manager-driven schedule changes. So overall, our findings are providing greater, suggest the laws are providing greater advance notice, additional pay for manager-driven schedule changes, and more employee control over schedule changes, but with some caveats.
So who were the primary communities? You've described a few already that are impacted by your research, and how did you include them in this study?
As we designed the survey, we sought input from staff at the offices of labor standards in Seattle, Chicago, and New York to help ensure both that our questions were correctly customized for the city, and they were very helpful, and that the findings would be useful to them in their education and enforcement efforts. So we hope that by knowing which provisions are being implemented most consistently and where there's the biggest gap between legal requirements and workers' experiences, that information will be helpful in targeting their efforts. I also think that our findings can help inform policymakers and policy advocates who are refining administrative rules and working to expand these laws to other municipalities. And watching and really being involved in the development and enactment of Fair Workweek laws, one of my frustrations is seeing how carve-outs on coverage, especially around predictability pay, are added to the laws right before passage or through the administrative rules right after. But from talking with frontline managers, those carve-outs are confusing. They make their job more difficult, not easier. And our current findings on employees' experience suggest the carve-outs undermine the potential of the laws to set universal standards for scheduling practices in covered industries, which is the goal of the policy.
And is there any other actors you'd want to call out that you hope would use this research to make a change outside of the policymakers you've discussed?
Well, I think overall employers should look at our findings, both from our WorkWise employees' experiences and also the managers' experiences, and realize that they can do a lot to help their managers enact these laws. And so I would hope that employers would pay attention to this research too. The fact that there's variation across the same set of employers means that some managers can do it and some can't. And some are having more difficulty. And that's where corporations can come in and provide the kinds of supports that managers need to deliver better schedules to their workers.
And there's so much here, across the states that you've talked about. So I want to ask you one final question. Is there anything else you'd want to call out for us that was interesting or surprising to you when you did this work?
Well, not exactly a finding, but I guess I was surprised that evaluating workers' experiences with municipal level employment laws is as challenging as it is. I mean, in our manager survey, we identified businesses. We knew if they were covered by the law or not. Then we recruited managers to interview. So we knew, what comparisons. But in studying employees' experience, there's not a big list of employees to sample from. We had to gather information from people and figure out where they worked, which was very hard because if you go to Chicago, everybody lives and works in Chicago, but they don't. They often live in, adjacent areas. And so one of the clever ideas that our research team had was to embed a Google map within the survey on which respondents could identify their place of work. And this didn't solve all the problems, but it really very much increased our confidence that the information they gave and who they worked for, they found it on the map, and we could identify whether it was within coverage or not.
That's fascinating. And that's incredible use of technology that I think hopefully should be applied to the rest of the legal landscape. So thank you, Susan. And thank you for all of your work. This was incredibly interesting and I think will be incredibly impactful in all of the places that have these laws and all of the places that could. This research will be available online in the coming months on the WorkRise website, and anywhere else that we can help find it, including the University of Chicago. So thank you so much, Susan, and we hope to talk to you soon.
You are welcome and thank you.